Thank you.
The main Malthusian idea I want to challenge today is the idea that resources are finite. The idea that the Earth itself is finite. The idea, as we've just heard, that we live on this finite planet and therefore we can only have a certain number of people living in a certain number of homes, eating a certain amount of food. Because it seems to me that the population control lobby's obsession with finiteness really exposes what they are all about. It really helps to reveal the historical illiteracy and the social pessimism that underpins the pseudo-scientific movement of Malthusianism. The Malthusian focus on finiteness explains firstly why they are always wrong about everything. Secondly, why they are so misanthropic. And thirdly, why they put forward such illiberal proposals, dressed up, of course, in the language of female empowerment. On the first point, Malthusians are simply wrong to say that resources are fixed, that we can measure and predict when they will run out. It seems commonsensical to say that the Earth is finite, and possibly a bit mad to say that it isn't. But it's important to recognise how fluid and changeable resources are. It's important to recognise that the usefulness and longevity of a resource is determined as much by us, by the level of social development we have reached, as it is by the existence of that resource in the first place. Resources are not fixed in any meaningful sense. Resources have a history and a future, just like human beings do. The question of what we consider to be a resource changes as society changes. So, in ancient Rome, for example, one of the main uses of coal was to make jewellery. Women liked the look of this glinting black rock hanging around their necks. No one could have imagined that thousands of years later, coal would be used to power massive steam engines and an entire industrial revolution, forever changing how we produce things and transport them around the world. 2,000 years ago, the only way people used uranium was to make glass look more yellow. It was used to decorate windows and to decorate mirrors. You would probably have been locked up or subjected to an exorcism if you had suggested that one day uranium might be used to light up and heat entire cities, or indeed destroy entire cities at the push of a button. So the exact same resource can do very, very different things depending on social and technological development. It was social limits, not physical limits, which meant that ancient Romans couldn't use coal to make things move, and other ancient communities could only use uranium to make glass look more yellow. And the main problem with resource pessimists, such as Malthusians, is that they continually mistake social limits for physical limits. They naturalize social limits, reinterpreting and representing problems of social development as problems of nature's shrinking bounty. They make the fatal flaw of arguing that the main barrier to progress and human comfort is the barrier erected by nature's limited resources, when in fact it is the barrier erected by the crisis of social imagination. That is why they are wrong about absolutely everything, why every prediction made by every population scaremonger through history has failed to materialize. A very early population panicker was the 2nd century Christian philosopher Tertullian. In 200 AD, Tertullian said, "We are burdensome to the world. The resources are scarcely adequate for us. Already nature does not sustain us." But back then, there were only 180 million human beings on the entire planet, about the same number that now lives in the eastern part of the United States. The problem for Tertullian was his understandably limited imagination. In his time, pretty much the only known resources were animals, plants, and various metals and minerals. He had no way of conceiving of the enormous abundance of resources inside the earth, which lay dormant because of social limitations, not natural ones. Thomas Malthus himself, the messiah of modern-day Malthusianism, argued in the early 1800s that food production wouldn't be able to keep a pace with human reproduction, and as a result there would be epidemics, pestilence and plagues that would sweep off millions of people. Yet in Malthus's era there were only 980 million people on Earth. Today there are more than that in China alone, and they all have food to eat. Malthus's problem was that he also saw natural limits where in fact there were social limits. His fundamental pessimism meant that he considered it impossible for mankind to develop beyond a certain nature-enforced point. And yet, after he made his population pronouncements, through the Industrial Revolution and various social revolutions, mankind did overcome many of his social limitations and found new ways to make food and to deliver it to the masses around the world. It is their finite obsessed outlook which means that Malthusians are spectacularly wrong all the time. You would literally be better off listening to Mystic Meg than you would to the OPT. Malthusians pose as a science-based rationalist movement that has worked out through equations and pie charts what the carrying capacity of the Earth is, but actually, going back to the primary school illusion, they continually make a schoolboy scientific error. Their error is to imagine that population is the only variable, the only thing that grows and grows, while everything else, including resources, society, progress and discovery, stays roughly the same. But the truth, as history shows, is that population is not the only variable. Resources are also a variable. So is mankind's vision, his ability to rethink and tackle problems. These things grow and change just as population does. And Malthusian mathematics doesn't add up because their social pessimism means that they fail to factor in probably the most important and decisive variable of all, which is mankind's ingenuity. And it seems very clear to me that despite everything Roger says, the problems we face today still are absolutely social rather than natural. We now live under a cult of sustainability, a social and political framework which says that we should never overhaul what exists and instead should make do with it as best we can. And this idea of sustainability is anti-exploration, anti-experimentation, anti-risk, all the qualities we need if we are going to make the kind of breakthroughs that earlier generations made with coal and uranium and everything else. In contrast to the past, today, unfortunately, human society is accommodating to social limitations and accepting the idea that they are natural rather than trying to break through them. Malthusianism is not a taboo. The Malthusian mindset is winning, and that, I think, is a tragedy for all of us. The second important thing about the Malthusians' concern with finiteness is that it helps to explain why they are so misanthropic. Over the past 200 years, Malthusians have tended to look at people as simply the users up of scarce resources. They have tended to view nature as the producer of things and mankind as the consumer of things. And this view of people as consumers, almost as parasites, inevitably leads them to seeing human beings as the cause of every modern social ill, and therefore reducing the number of human beings as the real solution to every modern ill. Their focus on finiteness means that they conceive of humanity as a kind of bovine force hoovering up everything that it comes across. And the ascendancy of the Malthusian outlook can really be seen in the way that people are frequently discussed these days as consumers, exploiters, the users of resources, the destroyers of their surroundings. So, more and more, mankind's building of cities and factories is referred to as an eco-footprint, as if it is something dirty and destructive that should be cleaned away. Our use of natural resources such as wood and oil is referred to as the rape of the planet. Even our use of water is now problematized, with various charities telling us to measure our water footprint and only to shower every other day. We're now encouraged to be water neutral. And in the past, there was another word for water neutrality. It was death. There is no living creature known to man that can survive without water, and yet today we're supposed to feel guilty about using it. And I think this popular depiction of mankind as gorging on nature's fragile resources is not actually based on scientific fact or hard proof of widespread resource depletion. That is clear from the fact that even water is now included in the list of resources that we should feel guilty about using. Only a mad person could believe that water will ever run out. No, this view is based on a profound philosophical shift in our attitudes towards ourselves. A shift from viewing humanity as the tamer of the planet and the creator of society towards viewing humanity as a plague on the planet and the destroyer of our surroundings. And it's a spectacularly one-sided view of people, because we don't just use resources, we also create them. We are not just consumers, we are also producers. In fact, I would argue that we have realized the potential of this planet. Without humans, it would just be another ball spinning through space, full of useless coal and pointless uranium. But we have extracted that coal and uranium and made something amazing with it, modern human society. We created the social conditions in which the Earth's resources could be used to their full potential. We created the means for extracting and transforming those resources. We created cities, workplaces, and homes on the back of those resources. And every time we managed to get more and more stuff from fewer resources and created new resources along the way. And I think the Malthusian view of humans as little more than consumers really leads to some very dodgy ideas on their part. So last year, the OPT launched a website called Pop Offsets, which involved encouraging well-off Westerners to offset their carbon emissions by paying for people in the third world to stop procreating. The idea is that you log on, enter information about a flight you recently took or how much you've been driving your car, and then the site tells you how much carbon you have used and therefore how much you should donate to a third world reproductive charity. That charity makes up for your carbon use by cutting back on the pitter-patter of tiny carbon footprints in countries like Kenya. So if you took a round trip from London to Sydney, that adds up to 10 tonnes of carbon, in which case you're asked to donate £40 to help prevent the birth of one child in Africa. That is the value that modern-day Malthusians put on human life. It is roughly equal to 10 tonnes of carbon, or one holiday in Australia. Apparently, these lives have no intrinsic worth, no moral or cultural meaning. They're simply bargaining chips in some wealthy Westerner's desire to absolve himself of eco-guilt. And such misanthropy is a direct result of the kind of cult of finiteness. Because when you view human beings as the ravenous users of resources, then you start to see human life itself as a pollutant, as a drain on the planet. That is why Malthusians constantly refer to every newborn child in Africa as another mouth to feed. In their worldview, another child is not simply something to celebrate, it is simply an eating machine that needs to be attended to. And, to re-quote myself, courtesy of Roger, we are actually more than mouths to feed. We have lost sight of the fact that human beings are also brains that can think, minds that can create, and hands that can work. And thirdly and finally, the elevation of the Malthusian idea of finiteness gives rise to authoritarianism. Because when you see everything as running out, when you believe that anarchy is just around the corner, then you become a bit like those crazy men in Alabama who think the world is coming to an end, so they stock up on guns and baked beans and never leave the house. You develop a siege mentality. You see other human beings as a kind of tsunami of destruction, and almost any measure can be justified to hold that tsunami back. But of course, the Malthusians have learned from their past. They have learned from their earlier dalliances with eugenics in the 1930s and forced sterilization in India in the 1970s, and from their complicity in the development of China's one-child policy in the 1980s. They know from those experiences that population authoritarianism is not popular. Women don't like to be told what to do with their wombs. Men don't like being forced into vasectomies. So modern-day Malthusians have adopted the language of reproductive choice and female empowerment. But this is really, really disingenuous. Because when you promote family planning on the basis that too many children will destroy the planet, on the basis that women are creating future pollutants, on the basis that our offspring will turn into planet rapists, then you are not giving women choice. You are giving them an ultimatum. You are telling them that their individual behaviour is destructive, and if they carry on, the world will come to an end. That is coercion. That is an interference with people's free will. And it is the end result of a misanthropic outlook which says that the worst thing a human being can do is create another human being.